Welcome everybody to Good Cop, Bad Cop. This is, I think, the first, at least within the University of Cambridge, wrap-up of the recent COP30. I'm Jerome Neufeld. I'm an Associate Director at the Center for Climate Repair. I'm also probably most relevantly one of the co-directors of the Master's Program in Quantitative Climate Environmental Sciences. I'm essentially going to be playing the role of passing the microphone and helping to pick your questions. So get ready to ask our panelists lots of questions. But we have a distinguished array of panelists today with a huge wealth of experience from both this COP and past COPs. And so we're going to start off our event by getting their impressions of what's gone well with COP, what's not gone well with COP, and where is COP going into the future, and then we're going to open it up to all of you to ask all of your questions. But before we do, let's start by having the panel introduce themselves.
Yeah, it's excellent to be here, everyone. So I am Professor Piers, Forster from the University of Leeds, and I also sit on the UK Climate Change Committee, and I had a role at this time. I firstly presented the climate science to the whole COP at the beginning of the COP, and the other thing I did was really trying to support other countries to set up something like the Climate Change Committee in their own countries.
Hello, my name is Joanna Depledge. I'm at Cambridge with the Centre for Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Governance. My entire life's work has basically been focused on the COPs, so it's a real pleasure to be here and be able to give you my impressions on this 29th COP that I've been following from the beginning almost.
Hello, my name is Zoe Quiroz-Cullen. I'm the director of the Climate and Nature Linkages program at Fauna and Flora. We're an international conservation organisation, part of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. So I was also representing the CCI task force engaging with the COP30 process. Unsurprisingly, our strong focus was on nature and how nature is represented in the climate negotiations, but linked to that, how it's enabling both the mitigation and adaptation lens and supporting local people who are critical to climate action.
Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Natalie Jones. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, and my focus is on energy, specifically on the phase out of fossil fuels. So everything I was observing at COP was really from that lens. Thanks.
I'm David Reiner. I'm Professor of Technology Policy at Judge Business School across the road. I'm a political science and a scientist who's been following COP since just a little bit after Joe started. I was in Kyoto in COP3 as a graduate student and have been following the festivities ever since.
Hi, I'm Sienna. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a bit. I'm an engineering student here and I'm the action lead on Cambridge Climate Society. I'm looking to work sort of in the energy sector as well, sort of generation, efficiency, storage. And I was at COP30 representing a mental health and reforestation NGO, so sort of advocating for the bridge between like health and climate and all of the interconnected problems that come about with it.
Great. So as you can see, there's been a huge wealth of experience, both past and present, with COPs. And I think we'll just start, because COP has, as it were, both some huge pluses and some challenging difficulties. So let's start with, what were the successes from the recent COP30 period?
Yeah, well, perhaps the biggest success from my point of view, in fact, is that there really are still a lot of countries that are really trying to cooperate with each other, and perhaps the negotiations didn't go well as we thought they would, but if you have a look at the implementation agenda, there are a lot of countries that are really just getting on with the delivery. There was about trillion worth of investment put toward renewables. There was a whole lot of work done on carbon dioxide removal. There was stuff in the just transition being done too. So there was a whole lot of stuff being done with really good cooperation between countries outside of the negotiations.
Joanna?
Thank you, Piers. I think it's a bit difficult to think of positives, although I do have one. I think from my perspective, this is good cop, bad cop, right? From my perspective, this was the most bad, the worst COP since COP25 in 2019 that was immensely disappointing. So I think for a lot of us, there was a lot of hope that was vested in the Berlin COP because Baku had been so difficult, and this time we had a country that had been very active in the COP process in Brazil. We had a country with a very good reputation on the international scene. There was the huge symbolism of the COP being in Brazil, where the 1992 Earth Summit had taken place. It was also 30 years since COP1, it was 35 years since the launch of negotiations, 10 years since Paris. There's this real hope that there would be a bit of revival with the COP. And of course, all this was against the context of huge headwinds, in terms of geopolitical turmoil, in terms of, obviously President Trump in the White House. I don't need to say much more about that. So, and I think, unfortunately, to a large extent, it was the geopolitical headwinds that were out. However, I'm supposed to be talking about positives. So, I think I completely agree with Piers in that the most important positive was that climate multilateralism hung on. So Simon Steele, the Executive Secretary of the Secretariat, said that multilateralism was alive and kicking. I think that's going a bit far. But it's great there were no more defections from the Paris Agreement, that it was entirely possible there would be some. There were none. And in the headline decision that I'm sure we'll all talk about, the Mutirao decision it was called, Global Collective Effort in Indigenous Languages, in here there were many reiterations and reaffirmations very strongly of climate multilateralism in general. There was even this really cool phrase about how we hope that the Paris Agreement will once more return to universality, or something like that, which is diplomatic speak to, US, please come back. So I think this was really important, and I'll just end by pointing you to something else, which was this language in the headline decision was then reaffirmed, in fact bolstered, in the G20 declaration. The G20 met in South Africa a couple of days overlapping with COP actually, and what they came out with was even stronger than the COP decision. So I think that shows that multilateralism is still there, even if it has to be slightly in the background because of the White House incumbent, let's call him.
Thank you, Joanna. Zoe?
Thanks. So from a nature perspective, clearly, we know that nature-based solutions to climate change offer the potential of up to a third of the mitigation we need by 2030, and that's time sensitive. We need to protect and restore as much nature as we can, as quickly as we can. It is equally important to climate adaptation and building resilience, and it's increasingly urgent. I think it was really moving to be in a place where delegations were arriving from places like Jamaica, the Philippines, where they were reeling from the impacts of climate change on their territories in real time, to hear them speak about the urgency of those things. In terms of positives, we did see some for sure. I would say the ocean, the recognition of the role of the ocean, as well as forests and other terrestrial ecosystems in tackling nature was very much affirmed. It was recognised by the Brazilian presidency in the action agenda ahead of COP, building up to it. And it remained and was recognised in the global Mutirao alongside terrestrial ecosystems. What it didn't do was take us much further in terms of legal commitments and obligations from what had been achieved before. So there was a reiteration of the target to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030, but no greater action around moving that process forward. In terms of some of the energy that was building, I think what landed in the decisions was one thing. What was beginning to bubble up and create a lot of energy in kind of subgroups of countries was really powerful. One example of that is the Brazilian initiative around a roadmap for deforestation, which was supported by 90 plus countries. It didn't just get into the decision text at the end, but there is going to be a continuation of that effort going forward. We were also very closely following work on adaptation, particularly the role of ecosystem-based approaches and local leadership in adaptation. And that was a bittersweet deal. There was a tripling of finance for adaptation, absolutely critical, but without a baseline set, and also a pushing back on the time frame of it from 2030 to 2035. That's somewhat empty words for people that are dealing with the issues right now. But it's a really important signal. There were also indicators adopted to track implementation of the global goal on adaptation. That's important, but what was 100 really expertly crafted indicators became 50-something indicators, some of which didn't even make sense. So again, a mixed result, I would say. Other aspects, there was a real hope around recognition of the synergies between the three Rio Conventions and the critical role of nature at the heart of all of those. The Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention to Combat Desertification, of course, the UNFCCC. That didn't go any further than previous recognitions of the importance of the work of the Joint Liaison Group, but it didn't embed any greater progression around the urgency to enhance synergistic action on these issues. We're coming up into a year which will have all three COPs of all three conventions in 2026. UNFCCC did not manage to echo the commitments of those other conventions around enhancing cooperation, but we hope that that will make progress in the year ahead. We were also carefully watching the work to ensure recognition of Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights in a just transition, in nature-based action. There were some good things, again, somewhat parallel to the core decision text, but certainly recognition of the role of IPs, LCs, and Afro-descendant groups in the Global Muturao text, but also the Intergovernmental Land Tenure Commitment, which is really important. That's 14 countries plus one subnational government, but recognizing the importance of clarifying and strengthening rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities over 160 million hectares in tropical forest countries, coupled with recommitments to the Forest and Land Tenure Pledge to finance some of that work. And for the communities that we work with on the ground, trying to support their efforts as nature stewards. You can't underestimate the value of having that kind of commitment in place. It's absolutely critical. I would say this was badged as the COP of Truth in the Global Muturao. I think you can't really have a COP of Truth that doesn't mention fossil fuels. We'll hear more about that. But at the same time, I think the energy around building towards a roadmap on the transition away from fossil fuels is something that we are pleased, of course, to see, and there's a date set in April for a first international conference on that. So the leadership from some of the parties on this agenda is what gives me real hope for the future, I would say.
Thanks. Natalie?
Well, quite a few of my highlights have been spoken about, but I have just one more to add to this great list. So for a number of years, there's been what's called a work program on just transition. So parties have been kind of in dialogues, they've been having workshops, they've been talking some more. And you might ask, what is all this talk leading to? Well, at this COP, they agreed to develop a just transition mechanism. And you might also ask, okay, what is that? What does that mean? But it's essentially a more kind of institutionalized body where efforts on just transition can be more coherent, more coordinated. It can have it can link up like the exporters and importers a bit more of fossil fuels. It can provide some avenues for funding commitments to then flow down into where they need it on the ground. And this was an initiative, importantly, that came from civil society. It actually originated in a proposal from the Climate Action Network, and it was then taken up by the G77 in China, the major group of developing countries at the COP, and then ultimately it was adopted by all parties. I think that's a win that deserves to be recognised. And then the other thing I will say is, I'm just building on what Zoe said about the fossil fuel roadmap issue. Yeah, I mean, it was almost a surprising issue at this COP because it wasn't on the agenda, but then in the opening plenary, or in the leaders' statements rather, President Lula of Brazil, he kind of said at the start, right, what we really need is a roadmap for ending deforestation and also a roadmap for ending our dependence on fossil fuels. And that kickstarted a lot of countries into thinking, okay, this is something that is winnable here, something that the presidency of this conference wants to see. And ultimately, by the end of the conference, there were nearly 90 countries who were outspokenly, explicitly in support of such a roadmap. And I think this, like Zoe said, provides hope for the future, yes, but it also provides hooks of accountability because now we have a list of all the countries that have said, actually, we think that what was agreed in Dubai a couple of years ago on transitioning away from fossil fuels, that's a good start, but it's not enough. We need concrete roadmaps. And so now we can say, the citizens of each of those countries can say, hey government, this is what you were pushing for at COP, so are you walking the walk when it comes to your action on a national level? I think it provides some really important hooks there.
Thank you, Natalie. David.
First thing to say is this is COP30. So the fact that this wasn't a particularly exciting COP is not that surprising. There have been obviously major events like COP21 in Paris, like arguably COP26 in Glasgow. Actually, arguably in terms of fossil fuels, the breakthrough in the UAE was actually quite noteworthy. So one wouldn't really expect every year to have some major event. On the other hand, I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about the geopolitical headwinds that I think Joe mentioned, at least in passing. And so it depends what your expectations are for what success or failure are, right? So for those of us who follow not just climate, but kind of environmental protection, international environmental protection discussions, a month before COP30 was a very contentious IMO, it's the International Maritime Organization meeting here in London, where there was previously had been an expectation that they would bring in kind of a first ever carbon price on shipping. And this would have been a real, genuine breakthrough. It had been kind of many years in the making. And what you saw was a US administration under President Trump come in and really very aggressively, I think maybe to the surprise of many, very aggressively work to completely undermine the international negotiations. It didn't quite collapse. They sort of postponed it for a year in the way that international meetings do. But it was a sign that when if they would put their minds to it, the current administration could not just be quiet, but actually work actively to undermine the negotiations. So it was not necessarily a given going into COP30 that would be the case. So it depends whether you take that as a positive or a negative, right? One way of thinking of it in a more negative light, a more positive light, is that they didn't act in as belligerent a way. The more negative side is that they didn't see that there was as much at stake, right? So in the IMO meeting, they were going to be passing a new piece of carbon tax, kind of this breakthrough carbon tax that really would have made a difference. And the fact maybe that they weren't as aggressive meant that there wasn't as much at stake in COP30, and it wasn't worth the same effort that they went through in London. So that to me is, again, it's glass half empty, glass half full view. But I think at the moment you're dealing with we've had many instances where the US administration has been climate skeptical, difficult, has withdrawn from various international protocols, but I don't think you've had quite the same level of aggressive antagonism that we saw at the IMO this past year.
Great, thank you, David.
Thank you.
Sienna?
I think the most powerful thing about this COP was the power of the people. Like, this was supposed to be dubbed the People's COP, hence it's in Belém, very close to the Amazon rainforest, close to all the indigenous groups. And I was so glad to see the indigenous people fighting for their voices to be heard, because they are at the center of this. And people like youth from Brazil also spoke up about this, and in the negotiations they said, imagine that somebody who has no idea how you live your life, any idea about you, is making all these decisions for you, and you have no say in anything. So I'm really, really glad that attention was brought to this. And also, it was a great space to voice stories and for collaboration. So even though it felt at times like, oh, maybe some of the bigger players aren't here, the momentum is there. And Al Gore, the US previous vice president and Nobel Peace Prize winner, was there. And what he said was, he told us his favorite equation, which is 195 minus 1 is not 0. Like, there are so many people still in this, and everyone's voices have a right to be equal. So he described it as like a huge wheel of momentum turning, but within it there are small wheels going the other way. But we can choose to focus on the bigger wheel, find people with similar sort of goals with us, and team up, because this is happening. It just needs to happen at a larger scale and faster. So, yeah.
Great, thank you, Sienna. Okay, so you've heard good COP, albeit possibly tainted good COP. And now let's hear a bit of bad COP, and maybe 2 or 3 minutes each. And I want to sort of prod people to ask not just what are the sort of bad parts about COP, but is COP really a mechanism that's still working? Is it something that is still useful going forward? So, shall we go in reverse order? Start with Sienna?
Yeah, of course we can. So as mentioned before, COP, it does feel like a lot of talking. And I was actually in some dialogues where parties literally said, we have had informal consultations about this for ages. We know what Article 9.1 is. It's the developed countries financing, like the developing countries, like helping them out to move towards a sustainable transition. We need to put numbers down, we need action down. So sometimes things can definitely feel very slow, and also because it's COP, things have to be a unanimous decision. So it is very hard to sort of push these faster and at a larger scale. But the thing is, it is currently the only large-scale system that we have, and it is working to some extent, because from the Paris Agreement we were predicted to get to 4 degrees, and now it's somewhere between 2.1 and 2.8. So it does feel like a lot of talk, but the things that come out of that at different levels, like the sub-national levels, are really important, because they are often a lot more ambitious than what happens here. So obviously, like, there's a lot to go, and there's a lot of potential, like, that still needs to be reached, but like, no challenge, no fun. So we are on this mission.
Thanks, Sienna.
Thanks, Anne. Along similar lines, I think there is a question of what your expectations are. So if your expectations are that this will be some sort of transformative event that will somehow magically shift geopolitics, magically shift the interest groups that are aligned against more aggressive action, that's not going to happen, right? I mean, there's been lots of work that looked at this, and there's no evidence that that's going to have some big transformative effect. You do need it to do, I think what Sienna's describing is kind of that hard work year on year of grinding through many of these issues, some of which are more fundamental. That's not necessarily going to merit people turning up for a big event. That's it's kind of the underpinning work that needs to go on. I do think that it serves a useful purpose of putting people on stage. And so that gets their attention. So having President of Brazil, having dignitaries turn up, it's an opportunity to hold them to account. It's kind of, this is a chance for the world media to gather and pay attention to this issue, at least once a year. It's an opportunity to again have all these various scientists, other NGOs, actors come together, gain a bit of energy from each other. So those are all positive things. But fundamentally, it is that is not what needs to change to make greater progress. It is at the national level we need to see legislation. We need to see regulations come into being that will actually will require the progress that we need to see emissions reductions faster rather than slower. Having a talking shop is of value. It's value for those engaged with it, but ultimately it is at the national level that we need to be passing laws that will kind of make the progress that we need on climate change.
Thanks, David. Natalie.
Yeah, so I have two particularly disappointing things about this COP. The first is the NDC response. So, for background, under the Paris Agreement, all parties are legally required, this is one of the few legally binding commitments in the Paris Agreement, all parties are required to submit a national climate plan, an NDC. By the end of this COP, about 120 parties had done so that means more than a third actually had not. And what we know from the NDCs that had been submitted is that they are insufficient to meet the 1.5 or the 2 degree targets that we have in the Paris Agreement. They're insufficient on a whole range of indicators. And essentially the whole architecture of the Paris Agreement relies on these NDCs being handed in, then this under so-called ratchet mechanism where there's the global stocktake every 5 years that assesses the collective progress towards compliance with Paris Agreement goals. And we've had the first global stocktake that concluded in 2023. And the message from that was clearly that NDCs are insufficient and parties have to do better the next time around. Now, what we're seeing this time around, a lot of parties, I shouldn't say all parties, but a lot of parties haven't done that much better. And what's more is that a lot of parties have regressed by not actually submitting an NDC, whereas we had, I think, near universal compliance in the first couple rounds of NDCs. So I think to me this raises some quite fundamental questions about whether the architecture of the Paris Agreement is working in the way that it was intended, but also when it's not working in the way that it was intended, what can be done about that. And so in the decision, in the final and the multi-rail text that others have mentioned, there were a couple of things established to deal with this gap. The first one was the Berlin mission to 1.5, which is this essentially a reporting exercise where the presidencies of this COP and the next COP will produce a report by the next COP that will have in it a range of actions that can be taken to close the gap. We had a kind of precedent for this in the Baku to Berlin roadmap to 1.3 trillion, which was made over the last year, and it was about how to reach this this climate finance goal of 1.3 trillion. And the experience from that really shows that these kind of standalone reports, they don't really have a clear hook back into the process. There wasn't a lot of discussion or follow-up from that report at COP30. So to me, it's quite questionable what will come out of that. And I see, I will not mention the fossil fuel issue because I think others will touch on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalie. So
Thanks. I definitely dived into the bad cop as well as the good cop in my first response. So I'll just dig in a little bit more on a couple of points. One is, I think, reflecting on that point around NDCs not yet being ambitious enough, but also the sort of the real realities and the crunch points that in particular developing countries are facing in terms of being able to action what is known to be needed. And I think, again, I'd go back to the real crisis point in the closing plenary of COP30, which was actually a big focus was adaptation and the fact that the indicators package for the global goal on adaptation was deemed a huge compromise on what had been previously developed. And then the adaptation finance has been pushed back further and further. And I think we saw a very unusual situation where the closing plenary was suspended and these striking photos of the president surrounded, mobbed, not aggressively, but, just really an intense discussion on how to resurrect this key moment of multilateralism where it just wasn't good enough. I think recognizing that is really important to confront. I don't know how you shift a process around really unlocking the changes in finance commitments when you have those geopolitical headwinds, where you have this double down focus on security and all sorts of other things going on. But I think that's very real and needs to be confronted much more clearly. I agree. I think whilst a different point, the just transition mechanism is an important space for some of those dialogues as well. I guess my thought is also reflecting on the accountability that can come from civil society rising up more and more. So we saw between 40 and 70,000 people involved in the March for Climate Justice on the middle Saturday of COP30. I think. And the lead negotiator for Panama was particularly vocal, a really incredible guy, I think, just talking about the fact that when leadership fails, we need more and more civil society leadership. And a lot of leadership isn't failing, but it's struggling in the context of these vested interests that we can't change easily, and these different perspectives. And I think it does come down to that implementation agenda. There is a lot of implementation happening. People are getting on with it. Young people, women, indigenous groups, businesses. So I think that mass accountability we need a lot more of to help shift some of the grind within the UN system, because we need both.
Great. Thanks, Zoe. Joanna, nobody's mentioned really fossil fuels yet. I don't know if that's for
Well,
you.
I'm not sure how much there is to say, really. I mean, a fossil fuel roadmap wasn't adopted. In fact, I will go into the reasons for that, so maybe I'll leave it. But David, you talked about expectations and what the COP can be expected to actually do. But I think we have to go back. I mean, the whole point of the climate change regime centred around 3 climate treaties now. The whole point was to bring countries together. The whole point was that countries would learn together and gradually their positions would reconcile. There would be a greater move towards collective action. The science would harden, and then commitments would ratchet up. That's the theory behind regimes, right? But instead, I think what we've seen at, first Baku and then Belém is actually a deterioration in climate politics, and I think that's extremely worrying. I mean, Piers might talk about that happening as well in the science space. But I think what we saw, especially in Belém, was that the absence of US leadership, okay, they were physically not there, which is good, but their absence had a real impact, because the fact is that when the US is there and being constructive, then there's progress in the climate negotiations. We saw that under Obama, under Biden, but when the US is not there, then everything seems to stand still and regress, and that's partly because there's no other country that's prepared to step into the leadership space. So the EU is too divided, it's too unwieldy, it's a bit distracted at the moment. And China's a leader at home in green tech, it really is, but it doesn't like to take the lead in diplomatic arenas. You see that around the world, so there's no one else. And, you know, David, there were actually suggestions in parts of the press that Trump did issue a few undercover threats. I mean, obviously not like IMO, but anyway. And something else we saw is that the climate negotiations always had a kind of north-south divide that's pitted the developed countries against the developing ones. And kind of that divide had narrowed around the time of Paris that enabled the Paris Agreement to be adopted, but now we can see it widening again. That's extremely worrying, very much around funding and climate finance, as we talked about. And what we're seeing as well is, because of this, is the fracturing, the breaking up of what's been called a high ambition alliance. So during Paris and afterwards, there were kind of groups of developed and developing countries that were working together, and that was a new thing. So with the EU, there were the least developed countries, the small island states, the progressive Latin American countries, and they were all working together, pushing for higher ambition, including on fossil fuels. That was a really positive force. But we saw that breaking up very much so in Berlin. So the LDCs, these developed countries, were not really willing to work with the EU. And personally, I feel concerned about the fact there were 80 and 90 countries pushing on fossil fuels. I don't see that as a positive. And why? Because that wasn't that many countries, right? There's 195 countries that are part of the Paris Agreement, and less than half were pushing for fossil fuels. And there's this big thing about, oh, if you're allowed to vote in the climate negotiations, then we'd have much stronger decisions. Well, in this case, we wouldn't. Yeah, because we would not have passed a vote with 80 countries. That, to me, was worrying. And all of this basically means that the balance of power has now shifted to the oil exporters, to the Arab group, which can be summed up as Saudi Arabia, and to other laggard countries like Russia. So unfortunately, that's where the balance of power is increasingly shifting. So that's what I see as the most worrying thing about COP30.
Thank you, Joanna.
Well, I absolutely agree 100% with Joanna. And perhaps, just speaking personally, the biggest concern that I have got is the politicisation of the climate science. So I had a job on the third day of COP to really present the observation of the way the Earth's climate is rapidly changing, and that being a direct result of the very high emissions, and it ought to be very straightforward to present that and to get that proved in the final COP document. But then I did witness that over the next 5 days of the negotiations, the text on the way the climate is changing, they all got taken out of the document. That whole thing did really come from pushback by 4 or 5 different countries that were really objecting to it. And it also frustrated me, in fact, what they were objecting to. If you had a look at their negotiating positions, they all complained about it on the grounds of kind of equity and diversity, sort of saying that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an organisation that assesses the science, they did say that it wasn't kind of equitable or it wasn't representative enough. But that's not true at all, because the IPCC has probably bent over backwards to be as representative as possible and to be as fair as possible. And it is just a politicisation by the big fossil fuel producing companies, by their big countries, and it is by countries like in India that absolutely do not want constrictions on the way they want to develop. So really, what they don't want is the scientific evidence that the way the world is rapidly changing currently can tie them back to what they have to do to reduce their fossil fuel production and consumption. So I do find that quite frustrating that they're sort of really trying to weaponize political correctness as a way to really push their own agendas.
All right. So you've heard a take from 6 people who have quite some deep engagement and experience of many COPs and of course of COP30, both good and bad. Now's the time to ask some questions. So we're going to circulate some mics around. Please stand up and direct your questions. You can direct them to the panel in general. We'll have 1 or 2 panel members respond, or you can direct it to a particular panel member. So we have a question back here. And maybe introduce yourself very briefly.
Okay. Hi, I'm Ian Webb from the Cambridgeshire Wildlife Trust. I might sound a bit ignorant, but who invites all the thousands of fossil fuel lobbyists? Isn't that one of the most important things? A direct question to Joanna, if it's all right. How much has their influence, the fossil fuel lobbyists' influence, increased throughout the COPs? Has it been only recently when they've realised that they're under threat, that they've started to ramp up their appearance and their impact, the negative impact on the development of something that we all need and cherish? Please,
Joanna.
thank you.
I mean, I'm happy to speak to it. I think there might be others. David, do you want to speak to that?
I mean, just on the first point, I mean, IPCA, which is the petroleum industry's environmental lobby, is an official NGO in the way that other NGOs are officially recognized by the UN, and they participate in the process. I would also say it's not particularly new. I mean, I think the media is maybe paying attention, counting up numbers, but in terms of the impact they've had, I mean, I think that's always had a very important impact. And I think it's also important to say that there are a number of countries that are highly dependent on fossil fuel extraction, and so they will either echo or be supported by the industry in a way that's quite mutually supported. So I mean, I think, again, I think there's more media attention to this, but I don't think this is in any way a revelation.
Natalie, Joanna, do you want to briefly comment on that as well?
So I would just add that I think where the fossil fuel lobby has the most impact is actually domestically. It's in actually forming domestic positions before the countries even get to the COP, right? I think once they're at the COP, I wouldn't say they had a dramatic influence, to be honest. So I'd say, domestically they do, very much so, that's true. I think David is absolutely right to point out that fossil fuel NGOs have always been there. They will always be with us. I think what's a bit more worrying is how countries are drafting fossil fuel lobbyists into their delegations. And to be honest, we're not really necessarily talking about the oil exporters. There's a lot of developing countries, that actually their delegations are absolutely swollen by the fact that they have a lot of fossil fuel industry executives that are there, and they're kind of funding themselves to go. So I think that's important. I'm not sure, does anybody else want to talk about the Secretariat Initiative? Do you want to talk about that, Sienna?
We brought this up when we spoke to the UNFCCC Secretariat, and someone asked, why can't they sort of be filtered through? Why can't you just have a look and, filter them out? But they just said, oh, we're a body that don't have the power to do that, we're just like an organisational body, like it would be wrong to do that. So I think everyone's scared of where the power like lies in making that decision and possibly making some enemies. So yeah, it's a tricky one. Yeah.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Back here.
Hi, thank you. Joanna, I'm a second year PhD with Centre for Climate Repair. Attended a talk at Downing on Friday, which was a similar panel, but on a smaller scale, which had a representative from the Indigenous peoples of Belém who actually attended COP. And one of the questions directed at her was, do you feel like you were given a voice when you were invited to go? And she said that her and other people from where she lived were invited, in bulk, and there were lots of representatives there, but they weren't actually given a platform at all to speak or ask their opinion on any of the discussions going on. And that was her first-hand account. Judging by what you saw of it, do you think the invitation was more performative, just to have people there to represent, or do you think that they actually wanted Indigenous peoples there as well? Thank you.
I was going to say, Zoe, do you want to?
I think there are probably a lot of different perspectives on that question, so I would definitely not hold any kind of a truth. The way the delegations, in terms of being inside of the negotiations and who gets to be part of the parties, the country delegations, I mean, there are, I guess in the same way as in many places, Brazil has a Minister of Indigenous Peoples, who is an elected official and somebody who was incredibly visible throughout COP and endeavouring to be representative of the indigenous peoples of Brazil and showing a lot of leadership in that. But of course, there are many tensions, and we saw that played out there in Belém. There was the incident in the first week where some indigenous peoples entered the venue. There was then a very peaceful line creation where those of us trying to go in went in through the exit on that day. For me, that was profoundly moving to see, because it's sort of not a functional possibility that everybody's inside the negotiations, and the question of whether they are representative enough and doing enough of a good job across all the country delegations is a really big one. But that simple act of blocking the entrance was profoundly moving, and I think what happened subsequently and the way that was dealt with was that the president of the COP, Correa de Lago, spent an hour speaking with those people outside, and then they moved to a different venue and continued the conversation. So I think it's very mixed. I'm sure it's not enough. I think what was striking, and that Brazil did well, was create the space where civil society could be very visible and very present, even though representation within, you can ask plenty of questions. And previous countries where the COPs have been, it's just not been like that. It's not been an enabling environment for civil society, whether indigenous peoples or others, to really be very visible and be very vocal. How much that translates into impact, I don't know, but I think a lot of people were very moved by it and were trying to take that into the venue as well.
Great, thank you. Other questions? I have one right back in the middle.
Good afternoon. My name is Ifoma. I am an MPhil student in quantitative climate and environmental science. And my question is, I get the vibe that the end of COP, we have this power vacuum, right? Is the idea that this vacuum is just going to exist until this current administration, US administration leaves, right? Or is the idea that, okay, this COP, we saw that the impact that the US usually have on decision making was felt? Do you get the sense that COPs that are going to follow, people are going to take the initiative to not let one person or one body have so much power over the decisions of the world? So that's one. And then the second one was, if countries are refusing to fund, like the developed countries are refusing to fund underdeveloped countries, right? Do we really want to keep pushing a platform of division, right? Because you said that you feel that there is now a lot of division, which counteracts the original purpose of the COP. If we're going to keep going down this line of division, is there any point to keep platforming, all of that? Thank you.
So let's take that first question first. Is anybody going to step into that power vacuum? How is COP going to manage their way forward? Piers?
Well, what I would say, there was definitely a shift in that kind of power at the COP, and I think that it can stay. So there was a big stepping up at COP from Central American and South American countries, and quite a lot of the Asian countries and the African countries, they're also taking those kind of leadership positions currently. So I think that there is an opportunity, in fact, for countries like, especially if you look at the China, India, kind of Brazil, I just think there is the opportunity for those countries to really deliver on the kind of transformation. And I think if you have a look where the COP will be in 2 years' time, the COP will be in kind of India. So I sort of think we could expect to see the whole world transition a bit within the next 2 years, just because quite a lot of the technology now are becoming more economical. So I think it is increasingly in countries' economic interest to transition. So I sort of think we are on the cusp of the world kind of changing, and the whole power dynamics begin to shift quite dramatically. But I think the issue that concerns everyone is that the fossil fuel producers are just kind of preventing that transition to occur as rapidly as it ought to be. So I think that shift is in the process, but I'm concerned of being artificially slowed down.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
One last brief point.
Just to say, the US has withdrawn from Kyoto or Paris 3 times now, right? So this is not new. And so that we should expect. I think the bigger problem, arguably, is maybe with regard to your second question with regard to finance, right? And this is not just a US problem now anymore, although the US shutting down USAID is dramatic. I mean, it is striking that the UK government has gone in fast reverse on its international aid commitments. And so I think one of the big challenges is, okay, well, if the US withdraws, I mean, Joe mentioned G20. What was striking was it became the G19. If the US withdraws, there still is a lot of activity that can happen without the US, but that does effectively mean that other countries, notably the UK, EU, China, others, do need to step up to fill that void.
Great. So, alas, we are running right up against the end of time, but we've at least heard a call to action. We all need to step up, the UK and others. But I think before we do, a huge thanks to the array of experience and wisdom and insight and commentary that we've gotten from our panel today. So let's thank our panel. Some of our panel will need to leave shortly, but please do come up and ask them questions as they head out. And I'm sure all